Yes. Thank you, Radio Študent, for inviting me. And hi, my name is Robert, and today I will talk mainly about algorithms. And this is actually part of my much bigger research. And since I'm, let's say, somewhere in the middle of my work, I will present some of my thoughts more than some more rigorous conclusions. So the title is Generating Musical Taste in Contemporary Algorithmic Cultures, let's say. And in this talk, I will address one of the most prevalent questions about music in the past decade. How does algorithmization impact the formation of musical taste? It's a very broad and big question, kind of hard to answer it directly, and perhaps this is the reason that now I have an hour to talk about that. First of all, if by taste we mean preferences and choices in music consumption, then the relevant algorithms are those found in recommender systems. And for over a decade now, recommender systems have driven music consumption on the internet. Online platforms have made recommender systems actually the dominant tool for optimizing personalization in media consumption. And as you probably know, these systems generate personalized user interfaces, and more broadly, they program, so to speak, cultural consumption by automatically calculating and predicting taste. So algorithms now automate the selection of music tailored to a particular user at a particular time. And this is evident in many features, actually, of today's streaming services, apps, applications, home pages, and so on. And for instance, Spotify's recommender algorithms are the foundation for the features like Discover Weekly, Release Radar, Your Time Capsule, On Repeat, Daylists, Recommended for Today, Similar to Your Taste, Search Results, Track and Artist Radio, and various other For You sections. So if you are using Spotify, you are probably very familiar with these features. So recommender system, I think that recommender systems should be seen as data-driven agents, supplementing human curation, filtering recommendations, or to put it simply, shaping taste. They represent a mutation in the evolution of music mediation, where musical culture becomes computable and algorithmically governable, subject to computational technologies capable of understanding and guiding human choices and preferences autonomously. And of course, as you also know, recommender systems are not only used in music streaming or media consumption and so on. Recommender systems don't just suggest what to listen to or what to watch. They also shape what we buy. So actually one of the earliest implementation of recommender system was Amazon.com, where Amazon was still a bookstore. So what to buy, how we connect, with whom we connect on social networks. So they make suggestions with who to follow, and even who we date. So kind of similar technologies are also used in dating apps, and dating, of course, is also based on taste. Not in music, but in I don't know. You can tell me your preferences or show me your app. So it is impossible to avoid these algorithms when using the internet, and this is also connected. The development of algorithms of recommender systems is connected to the transformation of the web from this first phase in the 90s, so-called open web, to the web 2.0 with user-generated content, platforms, and so on. So this, let's say, the last 20 to 25 years of internet. And what interests me about these algorithms is that they offer new possibilities for understanding human decision making and preferences. So how to understand formation of taste in music or in culture more general, through these engines. And of course, this understanding also depends on the algorithms themselves and the mathematical and cognitive theories behind them. One of the interesting things about these systems is also how they developed in this, let's say, more strictly scientific way, because this is a scientific product. Algorithms are mathematical, computational, but mathematical in essence. And the understanding of taste that is encoded in algorithms, as we will see, is based more on the cognitive theories than on the, let's say, social theories. So if you're familiar with sociology, I'm working in the field of sociology of culture and new media and media theories and so on. And if you are familiar with sociology, you know that sociological understanding of taste is based more or less on Pierre Bourdieu's work, and it's it's something that could be implemented in the algorithms, but these algorithms then would be probably different, that are and probably not so good, I think, that are now. And this is also something more of a deeper transformation here at work, because a lot of technological applications or AI now is in essence based on, of course, computer science, info, data science, and so on, and cognitive theory, game theories, and so on. But this is not the main subject of my talk today. Over the past decade, the impact of streaming and algorithms on music has sparked much debate, of course, as we know it. And in relation to music consumption, many critics have exposed the issue of algorithmic control or platform control, platform capitalism, so highlighting users' powerlessness in the face of platform capitalism. So sometimes this is, I think, a little bit paranoid in a way. So this feeling of control, and of course, algorithms are a great tool for controlling masses, as we know, and as we will see how they are doing it. And they are connected with the techno capital and so on. But I think that the question of control here should be a little bit more discerned, and that's why I think that it could be also counterproductive, because people who usually don't care so much about privacy and so on, this is one of the things that the researchers are now seeing, that we don't care so much about our privacy online, of course. We like to share everything, and we don't read different contracts when we are using new apps and so on. And if we are really concentrated on this algorithmic control, then things could get a little bit paranoid. And if I may add, we also see in the last in the post-COVID era how things are changing. So the problem is not the algorithmic control, but kind of old school censorship that is going on in relation to Gaza, for example, on social media platforms and so on. So that's why I'm not focused on this notion of algorithmic control so much in my work, and I will not talk about this strictly more or less negative side of algorithms and consumption through algorithms. So these critics argue that machines alienate authentic human choices, which are necessary for fostering open and inclusive musical tastes. And actually, me personally, I don't have problem with alienation of my authentic choices. So I think that this kind of critique is actually not enough. And more important, I think that these discourses, which try to only problematize algorithms, especially in terms of control, especially in terms that now we are in this loop with our own taste, which of course we need some guidance from some other human being. Our taste is not enough in this sense, and these discourses often, I think, defend a particular concept of musical taste tied to a specific historical period in popular music's development, and they are still kind of based in a generational mindset rooted in the 20th century. So I don't think I'm not implicating boomer-zoomer distinction here, but the things that things are changing, and we cannot understand tastes that are forming on platforms, Spotify, YouTube, and even now on algorithms, with something that is based on, I don't know, watching MTV or cassettes and so on, even in the early internet, downloading MP3 files and so on. So I think that we have to make a more clear break, and also, of course, we can see history with different with different eyes. And this is, I think, important for music because music is very affective cultural phenomena, and people are very judgy about their tastes. And of course, they think that their taste is the best and that punk was the only revolution in music in the 70s and the 80s, and then that the early rave scene is better than today's consummation of rave through TikTok. And so I want to problematize these distinctions and not to relativize them, but to see how they are functioning in the social context. And these discourses that I'm talking about also defend human autonomy against machine intelligence. And this is, for me, I think, one of the core problems of this topic. So now we don't have only distinctions, relations between people, communities, and so on. Commercial institutions, and then market and all this stuff, alternative versus mainstream. But the distinction is between human autonomy and machine intelligence. And of course, recommender systems are now domesticated technologies, so we use them every day, and I think we don't have this problem anymore with them now. Now there are other problems with AI on the rise, and perhaps I will, if I will have time, I will conclude with some more future-oriented examples. Okay, so to understand the effects of algorithmic systems on music and musical taste, I think that we must first place the formation of musical taste in its historical context. The shaping of musical taste has always been subject to social and, for this talk, more importantly, technological or media dynamics. And popular music is media reproduced music, so music that actually exists in some media has an intrinsic connection to technology. And I also think that music is actually very connected with the media development and technology in the 20th century. So that's why it's a good field to research, to investigate, to think about algorithmization even in more general sense. So I propose that music recommender algorithms are let's say, historical milestone in the emergence of machine intelligence in music. So intelligence that machine intelligence that is trying to understand music, to reproduce music, and to understand how people consume music, what are their preferences, choices, and how they understand music, and everything that is part of the music culture. And I will not talk, this is something that I'm interested in, let's say, in machine intelligence in the field of music. But I will not talk about how these algorithms are, how users value them. So if they are like angry about recommendations, or if they are actually fine with it. On YouTube, for example, we have a lot of comments when people are praising the algorithm. Oh wow, this song from 87 that nobody knows about is now in my feed and it's going viral, and thank you, algorithm. So this is important part of algorithmic culture, but I will not talk strictly about that. So in the following, I will first discuss the encoding of taste through algorithms, so how taste is actually encoded in the algorithms, so how algorithms understand the formation of musical taste. And this is something that is quite interesting for me, but also quite hard if you're not at least semi-good in mathematics. I mean good. I speak from the humanistic perspective, so you have to understand mathematics a little bit to understand how these things are actually forming. And then I will move to the personalization of music consumption, so something that is at the core of these processes, and then I will examine some examples of, let's say, algorithmic taste in music. So first I will talk a little bit about the history of mediation of music, so how the relation between music and media or technology or media technologies. Because in the 20th century already music consumption became highly media specific, both reflecting and driving media differentiation, and the transmission, preservation, and consumption of music through electronic media accompanied the rise of the music industry. As I said, popular music is a media, is music that is distributed by media, and expansion of popular music genres and formats, and the declining of classical and folk music. So in the early, actually, 20th century, music became consumed, preserved through media like vinyl, gramophone, radio. And the evolution of media not only differentiated music formats and consumption patterns, but also shaped distinction in taste, becoming a source of value judgment. So few words about music formats. We know that LP, long played expression, which is based upon the size of the vinyl, or radio edit format, so this short format, standardized format of music, and so on. So of course this is connected with marketing of music, with the commercialization of music, and so on, but also it is limited by the media which are distributing music. And even in electronic music culture, vinyl has long been seen as the most authentic DJ format or DJ practice, so using vinyl instead of MP3s, digital formats. And MP3s were long time considered the lowest form of music formats, because the quality of MP3, of course, is not so great than vinyl and so on, and it has this bad reputation, at least it had in the past. Despite most listeners, I think, are being unable to tell the difference between vinyl and MP3. And simultaneously, radio and other media also democratized music consumption, increasing increasing accessibility and personalizing the listening experience. This development, so I'm going really fast here through this history, but of course you know this stuff. These developments culminated in the early web of the 90s, where so-called gatekeeping systems were hacked and bypassed. I'm also sure that you know at least some broad description about the Napster lawsuit in the 90s and so on, and everything that was happening with illegal downloading, peer-to-peer sharing, and the crisis of music industry in the 90s, and of course the acceleration of consumption of music in the 90s. So we are in the era of the early internet, and as David Bowie famously said in a 1999 BBC interview, the internet is an alien life form. This interview is interesting because because I think that BBC journalist was asking him about isn't internet just a new way to distribute music and so on. And Bowie, of course, said no, it's an alien life form, and it was a good marketing strategy for his album, which I think was the first that was first on sale on internet and then in the physical local stores. Okay, so let's go to recommender systems history, and Ringo. Ringo was developed by MIT researchers in 1994, and it is considered to be the first music recommender system. It was quite simple. Users would send an email with a list and ratings of albums they liked, and then they received a list of recommendations in return. And Ringo was actually never commercially implemented and did not function as a platform. It represented the locally, let's say, bounded communities of the early web. And these communities, both engineers and early internet users, actually formed the milieu where recommender algorithms began to develop scientifically, technologically, and commercially. So now I will talk actually about how Ringo encoded recommendations and how musical taste was encoded in Ringo, and this, from our perspective, primitive system. Ringo employed a method known as social information filtering, or nowadays, or more commonly, collaborative filtering. And this model is foundational in the development of recommender systems and is based on the principle of similarity. And I will read you a quote by Ringo's engineers, and I think this will be more clear. So to quote, social information filtering exploits similarities between users' tasters to recommend or advise against items. Items are here albums. People's tastes aren't random. They are general trends and patterns within individual and group preferences. Social information filtering automates word-of-mouth recommendations. Unlike asking a few friends about a few items, a filtering system can autonomously consider thousands of people and items. So people tastes aren't random. This is also a sociological fact. We can measure taste. And at the core of any recommender system is therefore a prediction of whether a user will like a track or playlist. So if you look at these examples here, so for example, if we have three users, and user 1 likes item 1 and item 3, user 2 likes item 2, only item 2, and user 3 likes item 4 and item 3. And we can see that user 1 and user 3 they have a higher degree of similarity than user 1 or user 2 or user 2 or user 3. So then we can assume that we can recommend to user 3 item 1. So this is a very, very straightforward explanation. And of course, in reality, this is calculated by using methods like matrix factorization. And when we calculate these relations, then we can scale this process a lot. But this is actually kind of the basis of recommender systems. Modern systems are, of course, much larger. Spotify, with over 626 million monthly active users and more than 100 million songs. Spotify now a key player in the music industry. So, as an example, how big these systems are, and of course, these systems, because they are so big, they have power, and but this power is actually different from that of record labels, radios, or music television in the past. I will not talk a lot about this power, but if we try to think how big player Spotify is in the music business today, or actually in the music culture today, these numbers tell us actually a lot. And music streaming is, of course, increasingly automated, and recommender algorithms are actually enabling platform dominance over music consumption. So these algorithms are at the forefront of Spotify's power. And today's systems like Spotify's or some other system, SoundCloud, of course, has a recommender system, and Apple Music and so on, YouTube, TikTok, and actually every music platform today. So these systems are far more complex, employing machine learning and deep learning algorithms to extract data about music consumption on platforms, social media, and the open web. And explicit user ratings have been replaced by data on listening history, search habits, playlist creation, and many more. The time that we are listening to music and so on. All used to construct an individual's taste profile in a multidimensional space. So from this Ringo's initial mechanism, now we have a system that is based on machine learning, deep learning algorithms, and of course these algorithms could learn something about our consumption, that they are not determined in advance. So this is also something that is important to understand, that automation is not deterministic. Automation is just a process that is not done by ourselves. So let's look now at the Spotify's recommender system. And here on the picture, we have a so-called pipeline of Spotify's architecture for a Discover Weekly. So Discover Weekly is a playlist with music that you were listening to in the past and some new music. That's not so much important here. The important thing is that we will see different sections of Spotify's system, and of course the system is proprietary, and we cannot know for sure how it is working, but there are several sources from scientific community, music analytics. There's a lot of music analytics companies now or people on YouTube who are trying to break down the system and to see to recommend you, if you're an artist, how to take advantage of these systems. And of course, Spotify's own API provides some insights into its design. API is a programming interface, more for programmers than for end users. So at the heart of every recommender system are two components. So users and items, tracks, in our example, in this case. And Spotify employs 3 core technologies to generate track and user profiles. Collaborative filtering, so this collaborative filtering that was already implemented in Ringo's system, but now, of course, is much bigger and stronger, and so on. So collaborative filtering, natural language processing, reading, and audio analysis, so listening to music. And Spotify creates track profiles by analyzing metadata, so artist-provided metadata such as genre and so on, and also raw audio signals. And I think that in some article from Spotify's researchers, they said that they have now 42 features. So 42 features to analyze raw audio, to listen to music, including tempo, key, danceability, and so on. And perhaps we can look at that. So this is Spotify's API, and here you can actually retrieve some data about your history of using the platform, or about tracks and so on, but you need to read the data formats that Spotify is providing you. So let's see, here I have get tracks audio features, and we can see that this is some sample, something random, I don't know what it is, but we can see some numbers and some features like speechiness, tempo, blah blah blah. And with these features, Spotify's algorithms can decide how this track is, its danceability, or if it's hip hop because it uses a lot of speech, or if it's ambient music because its tempo is lower, and so on. So this is part of the this result here is algorithmically generated, and these are algorithms doing all the time. And we have also audio analysis, and here we can see some other features. And you can put here any track, and you will get this audio profile that Spotify is using in his recommendations also. Okay. So first we set raw audio, and Spotify also uses natural language processing to analyze web content, lyrics, and also user-generated playlists. So it reads the internet, blogs, scraping the internet, how people are talking, analyzing music, responding to music, and so on. And also what users are doing with their playlists, so the names of playlists and so on. And collaborative filtering then compares this track consumption patterns across users, so identifying similarities. So this is a profile of a track, audio profile and discursive profile, let's say with this part, language processing, and then the consumption patterns. So which users are actually listening to this track. And then we have a user profile, and user profiles at Spotify are based on data like play history, session length, playlist creation, engagement, time of the day, and so on. And these profiles are then the track profile and the user profile are then put together, are the basis for the calculation of based upon some playlist, for example, is generated for us. So it's a kind of complex system, but as we can see, there's a lot of in it. And of course, audio analysis is a whole another particular field in music, how machines are listening to music, understand music. And all of this is coming into our ears through using platforms. And what is also important is that these profiles, so let's say profile of me on Spotify as a user may differ significantly from users' own understanding of their tastes, so my understanding of my taste. Because we as a people are bad at explaining our tastes. This is something that was one of the principles that was at the core of development of recommender systems. So the people are saying one thing, and then if you look at their data, what they're listening other things. Okay, so I hope this was at least clear on the way, or at least informative. Now I'm moving to the personalization, and this is actually, I think, the biggest transformation of music consumption on the internet, is that now this consumption is personalized, as many other other things. And as I said, algorithms now understand music consumption in much more contextual ways. And for example, Spotify's dailies feature, so it's a pretty new feature, is based on patterns of music that align with specific times of a day. So here you can see this is a photo of my day list today. And you have like sometimes funny descriptions of this playlists, and this is a good example of how these algorithms are understanding that at Thursday afternoon I like this music, and of course I will like this music that is now generated for me. And as you can see, Spotify is trying to tell me that I listen to Mandible and Flux work on Thursday in the afternoon. I don't know what is Flux work, and we will get to these labels later. But yeah, algorithms are much more contextual now, and they are probably going to be even more contextual. So picking really some really detailed specific about our habits. But personalization, of course, is not just about personal use. It is about optimizing and accelerating consumption through the internet. And unlike in the mass media era, music consumption today is platform and algorithmic specific. So it's not media specific anymore. Of course, you can buy cassettes, listen to cassettes, and so on. But on the internet, this media specific basis of listening to music is to some extent gone. And with these algorithms, we are actually, I think, going out of the mass media galaxy. And why optimization? Why this subtitle here, optimization? Why personalization optimizes music consumption? Because let's say if you want personalize music on the radio, of course you have different shows with different DJs and selectors and so on, and they can, let's say, personalize because they're doing music, playing music for, let's say, some specific community, but there, of course, is a media limit to the degree of personalization. And on the internet, because internet is different technological media system, personalization, of course, is totally different. And so I think this is a big transformation that is going on. And the mass media today, of course, are also incorporated into the internet, into the flow of in the feeds on the internet, and they are filtered through algorithms and so on. The other thing is that in the 20th century, popular music, the rise of popular music led to taste becoming less about education or class exclusivity and more about satisfying some other preferences. Communities were forming that were not exclusive in this class in the sense of class formation and so on. And so the whole history of music taste in 20th century was kind of the expansion of popular music was connected with social dynamics. And algorithms have taken this much further by making taste generative. So when with human editors, DJs, and so on, the taste was not generative. So generative in the sense that now our taste is actually generating our consumption. So this is only possible with technology. So the personalization to get something that is truly mine is only possible through this loop with technology. And this is a situation where something that is more our is actually to some extent alienated in in technology. So this generativity of taste is something that is also, I think, very important to think about. And with the rise of generative AI and so on, this will probably be even more important in the future. Okay, and now some examples in no particular order. And as I said, I'm doing a more sociologically oriented research about the formation of taste in the age of algorithmic cultures. So how different uses of algorithms are connected to, let's say, some social dynamics, distinctions, what are the factors that are impacting the particular use of platforms, and why some people use platform, why some people don't use platform, and which music is more connected with which consumption of music is more connected with a recommender system than other. But I don't have I'm in the middle of my research, so I will present here some other examples that are perhaps slightly more oriented to the aesthetic side or to the side of labeling music. But the first thing that I would like to point out here is that we have to understand algorithms in algorithmic culture. Of course, we can understand algorithm on its own, mathematically, whatever we like. But since these are not this is not a deterministic technology, its behavior, it's of course based upon the usage. So the patterns, the data that is going into the machine is very important here. And it's a kind of loop, of course, between the input and output. So it is good to study algorithmic culture of music, and recommender system, of course, are one of the key technologies in modern algorithmic cultures, and also recommender systems in general. And what I mean by algorithmic culture, to quote Halinan and Stripas, so this concept is not, it's I think like 10 years old, and these are the authors that were they kind of defined, let's say, or open the question, what is happening in culture with the algorithms. And they're stating that algorithmic culture is characterized by the use of computational processes to classify, sort, and hierarchize people, places, objects, and ideas, as well as the habits of thought, action, and expression that arise in relation to these processes. So, algorithms in culture and culture in algorithms. And as I said, recommender systems have their own usage patterns. So users engage with them, some a lot, some not so a lot, and they have varying perceptions of how they work. So we have a lot of perceptions how algorithms are working. Some perceptions are, let's say, more scientific, some are just more of a mythology. And some users embrace them while others turn them off or avoid them altogether. And for me, it will be interesting to see which users are, which patterns actually we have of usage. Okay, so one of the effects of, or let's say one of the processes in algorithmic culture of music is memefication of music consumption. And I think that interesting example here is Spotify's Wrapped, so the personalized annual report that started in 2016, and it quickly became a viral internet event. If you're using Spotify, you are familiar with that. And you can see here one of the, I think it's from last year, the data that was provided from Spotify to me. So how many minutes I listened to music on the platform in a year. And this is also something that is, this data aspect of algorithmic culture is really becoming now culturally important, because people are sharing this and then comparing, like, oh, I listened a lot, or I didn't listen a lot, and so on. And users share their Wrapped statistics on social media, and they are actually generating huge engagement. Spotify even said that in 2022, 156 million social media posts were related to Wrapped. So it's quite an internet event when Wrapped is out. And this actually shows us how the act of expressing and sharing musical tastes has become a key part of contemporary culture. And at the same time, music and musical tastes are also becoming memes. And Wrapped itself often becomes a subject or a template for various internet memes. So people are making fun of Spotify's statistics, and they're making fun of the distinctions in music or music taste in itself. And memefication also describes the way certain music genres driven by algorithmic consumption transform into viral cultural phenomena on platforms. Like, I think that YouTube is a good example. There's a lot of viral music content there, and music that is consumed a lot, but we cannot put this music in the even some music we cannot, some content, musical content we cannot put into the category of music at all, but it is music. And we like to watch that. So music is also becoming a platform specific, and this is also, it is more evident, I think, on TikTok, but this is another subject. Okay, so let's move on. And declassification, we are still an example of Wrapped, and Wrapped also offers insight into how Spotify seeks to narrativize and gamify user content. For example, in the most recent Wrapped, users were categorized into 12 distinct streaming characters, and in the previous year, Spotify has also revealed users' audio auras and other personalized insights. So this is Spotify's corporate perspective, how to engage users, that they will share Wrapped, and that Spotify will be exposed on the internet. And this corporate preset gamification, so it's like a game of user identity, mirrors broader trends in internet culture. And Valentina Tani, in her book Exit Reality, Vaporwave, Backrooms, Weirdcore, and Other Landscapes Beyond the Threshold, identifies new classification practices as an integral part of internet culture. So new classifications, like in last year's Wrapped were categories like vampire, roboticist, hypnotist, and so on. So different labels for let's say really broad patterns of usage. Like hypnotist was someone who was listening album from beginning to the end, which is not a common practice anymore. Okay, so Valentina Tani, she writes, to quote, "The urge to categorize and the modular dynamic, different features being assembled to form ever new combinations, are key aspects of internet culture and inevitable consequence of inhabiting a system structured around databases, text, and hyperlinks. Each element, visual, sound, or text represents a removable, catalogable, reusable brick to add to one's personal identity building project." End of end of quote. And this trend also applies not only to internet aesthetics, so she's talking about internet aesthetics like Weirdcore, but also to the social categorization of listeners. And here we have an example, the YouTube channel Neopunk FMs. So it's a Zoomer channel, actually. So a Zoomer perspective on music distinctions. And in this video, the creators are classifying so-called down bad music along unconventional axes, like male manipulator versus virgin, or neurotypical versus autistic. And with this example, I think that once again, music taste becomes a meme. And of course, there's a lot of other classification on the internet or in the communities in real life that were not present in the past. And the last example is by content creator Blaster, I don't know how to pronounce it, and he holds a series of videos on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, where he reviews randomly selected music genres. And let's look at one example. Okay, bro step.
Want to be genre phobic. That's why I'm listening to every single music genre. Today's genre is give me something good. Oh, bro step. That sounds like it'd be the name for like a coordinated dance for frat bros. I'm gonna go listen to it throughout my day, and hopefully I don't turn into a bro. I'm back. Didn't know I was gonna be listening to my middle school playlist today. Here's some of my standouts in no particular order. Bro step is like if you took the wubs out of dubstep, made them a little more intense, and turned that into a genre. You know when you like wring out a wet towel? This feels like it's doing that to my ears. I don't really have a problem with this stuff, but there's definitely some other more melodic dubstep that I prefer. Oh, don't want to be genre phobic. That's why I'm listening.
Okay. So genres, along with the category of mainstream, remain one of the most enduring labels that create social distinctions among listeners. So listeners are grouping around some genres, as we know, and even as musical tastes become more omnivorous with genre crossing music. Listening to people are saying I'm listening to every genre, and already in the past this became a form of cultural and social capital. So if you're listening to a lot of genres, you can engage with a lot of people, and this also it is I think a value in the economy of music evaluation or taste evaluation. So you are open to a lot of genres, and even in the past, people, when they were trying to be as much as omnivorous as possible, there were still limits, of course. People would not listen to, I don't know, or let's say like this, black metal becomes popular like 10, 15 years ago, once again, but this time not popular in the same way that it was in the 90s, and only black metal formed in the early 90s, and only 20 years later it became something that people would listen to, besides, I don't know, pop music. There are examples of people who are listening to pop music, really pop mainstream music, and also some, I don't know, black metal things because it's edgy. But this was not possible, so black metal was one of the limit in the early years when black metal was also more controversial. So there were still limits. But if we go back to genre phobia and this example of Bluster, we can ask ourselves how many genres actually are there. And if we look at everynoise.com, this is a really good website with genres from, it is connected with Spotify, and here we can see that now there is 6,291 genres at Spotify, and many of these genres are, of course, algorithmic generated, and they have really funny names. And you can also see here the popularity, of course, pop, rap, and so on. But okay, permanent wave. I don't know what permanent wave is. Let's see. So this is another. This is example of how Spotify actually has fragmented genre to the really small pieces, and also all of this on this side. If you click on the genre, then there is automatically there is a connection to the Spotify to their playlists, so you can play with this and listen, for example, to Emo Mexicano. But what I'm trying to say is that I think the genre is losing its once distinctive role in shaping musical taste. And I don't mean this that it isn't just because this is not so because playlists are overtaking albums in the platform-based music consumption. So users on platforms listen more to playlists than to specific genres or albums, nor because omnivorous musical taste is becoming more widespread. So, as I said, I listen to everything. Every genre, of course, has its own limits, and I don't know if people are now listening to more genre there in the past. This is something that it will be interesting to see if omnivorous is still seen as value in taste formation. So I don't think that that everything is becoming more omnivorous. That musical taste is becoming more omnivorous, but that distinctions and aesthetic choices are being labeled in new ways and driven by algorithmic generativity that understands music more contextually. So, for example, Spotify heavily relies on a vector called mood. So the algorithms, they are trying to understand the mood that we are in when we are listening to music. And of course, we have a whole series of algorithmically generated playlists based on mood. And they're usually more or less like uplifting moods. I listen to a lot of music that certainly is not. It would be not considered that it is a positive music, but still these playlists are just like, I don't know. They're not going far enough in a pessimistic mood, but this is another thing. So I think that classifications and are becoming more fragmented, and that this is something that is connected with the algorithms, and also people describe their musical preferences nowadays in terms of vibe or core. There's a lot of core on TikTok, every core you can imagine. And I think that this is something that is showing how the formation of taste in music is changing. Of course, there's a lot of other things, and I'm interested in how is this all connected with the taste in this more sociological sense, in the sense that some classifications have different values, like in the past genres have all sort of fights between them, and these fights of course are changing and so on, and I'm interested to see if to what extent the distinctions from the past are still relevant, and what new distinctions are coming out of consumption of music driven by algorithms. And now I will conclude just a few words about, let's say, about the future, because as I said, recommender systems are already quite old and they are domesticated, but the generative applications that are using generative AI are newer, and there's a lot of going on debates about what is happening with what will happen with consumption on platforms, how large language models, so artificial models that could understand human via text or talk and so on, how will, if and how will be integrated into the consumption of music culture and so on. So we can speculate and perhaps imagine then that there will be a chance that we will instead of generated playlists like dailies or something like that, we will just type in, I don't know, I'm in a bad mood, something has happened, blah blah blah, play me music for that mood or something like that, and or that music that will be played will be artificially generated. Of course, this is not a topic of this talk, artificial use of AI for the production of music. And I don't know what the state of the art is there, but I would like to show you Suno. And here we have another, I don't know how many genres, and these are genres that people who used Suno, so AI system that you can generate music on Suno.com, and you can see here that there's a lot of funny, crazy genres, and let's listen to something. Barbershop Balkan Brass Band. That's it, thank you.
Let's have a 10-minute toilet break, and you can also grab something to eat in the main hall, and let's meet in 10 minutes here. Thank you.
artist. Sembra anche di Jules. Hello, everybody. Thank you for staying on this second lecture. My name is Jasna Babić Zrimšek. I work at the Peace Institute in Ljubljana, and I am also a program coordinator in Klub Gromka at Metelkovo mesto. Now we're going to talk about the subcultural theory, and especially about the new concepts. It's going to be, mostly readable, because the theory and the English language for me is not the best point. But however, I will start with a short history about the subculture theory, and then I will continue with the identities and relations, and then knowledge transfer, and then on the second part I will talk about the space and about rebellion, and this is basically it. So I will start. Through the history of development of subcultural theory, subcultures associated with a particular music genres have been considered the strongest, most visible, and the most enduring. The extent of their strength and resonance is most evident in periods of decline, when there is a fear that this has been the last subcultural phenomenon, and that there is not going to be nothing new. I remember the revolution that started with the electronic music that was happening after the punk became just one of the music choices. And then 10 years later, again, hipsters emerged through the indie music and invaded all pores of our lives in all their variation. When hipster mania finally calmed down and it seemed that everything has been said and heard, the rage of drill could be heard from the poorest streets of American and English cities. Interestingly, whenever there is a lull, the media begins to investigate whether there is some new subcultural phenomenon with youth culture that might cause a new moral panic. And invariably, during those periods, articles appear like the typical internet listings. For example, if you type in Google subcultures in 2024, they will show you the list: TikTok micro subcultures based on appearance and aesthetic, like cottagecore, dark academia, whistle girls, clowncore, and so on. And the media will convincing us that this is the new next big thing. So why are certain subcultures so attractive that they persist for the decades after their initial charge has worn off, while other subcultures phenomena quickly fade from the surroundings and also from the memory? When everyday subculture practice meet theory, enthusiasm can quickly turn into astonishment and doubt, sometimes even rejection. Analysis commits the worst crime against the subculture. It robs them of their appeal, interest, and excitement, and imprisons them in an ideal type model of dry theoretical concepts and studies. So let it be clear, no one involved in a subculture will ever claim to be a subculturalist. You will never hear a person say, I am a subculturalist. Always it's gonna say, I'm listening to punk, I'm listening to medic, I'm into electronic music, I'm skating, whatever, because the term subculture is a theoretical concept, an abstract construct, a device created by academics and further communalized by theorists, the media, parents, youngsters, and so on, to facilitate the understanding of the collective activities of young people. Furthermore, when we talk about subcultures, it is necessary to understand this phenomenon as a distinct part of the wider youth culture. The boundaries are not strictly defined, of course, but because of their fluidity, subcultures and youth culture are often equated in certain cases. Looking back, it's hard to imagine that youth culture is a relatively recent concept, with its origin in a post-war period. It is broadly linked to a social, economic, and technological development and the rise of economic prosperity, and more narrowly to the introduction of mandatory education, leisure, and the creation of the youth market. It soon became clear that young people can create their values and norms, the form of a culture within their own culture, so call it subculture. So the term youth culture was used between 40s and 50s from the previous century, although the first studies of young people appeared in the 20s in the USA, especially in a Chicago school. And the interest was mainly in young people deviance from general culture norm. So they basically were making first research about delinquency and not so much about the music. Then in the 60s, the phenomenon of intersection of youth, music, and style also became a central research concept on the old continent, especially in England, with the founding of a Center of Contemporary Cultural Studies in the University of Birmingham, which is still credited with the rich theoretical opus and of the so-called golden pioneering period of subcultural theory. Classical subcultural theory, both American and English, understood subcultures as closed, non-fluid wholes in conflict with the dominant culture. Chicago schools saw deviant behavior by the adolescents and other marginalized groups, not as pathological, but as a way of coping with conflict situation, of responding to or resolving social equilibrium. Later, the classic Birmingham school introduces a class structure and locates subculture as a phenomenon of the working class struggling against the class system in the sense of marginality. The struggle is primarily ideological against the cultural hegemony of different broad cultural structures, the working class or parental class, the dominant culture, and the mainstream culture. Subcultures are understood as subgroups within a national group made of different social categories like ethnicity, social class, gender, religion, which combine the form of a unity, sharply distinguish themselves from the dominant society, and have an impact of the individual. The focus of the research is on the Teds, Mods, North and Soul fans, skinheads, and punks, and their symbolic stylistic resistance to the structural change. Then came the 90s. That was a period of stagnation, as if the spectacular subcultures had faded, until the emergence of electronic music, which turned the classic theory of subculture on its head and demanded a rethinking and redefinition of subcultural attributes and relationships. A period of post-subculturalism emerged with on two different levels. First concepts were linking style, authenticity, and the internal dynamic of subcultures, and the second was a tendency to abandon the notion of subculture with numerous proposals for new names such as genres and articulation, substances, club cultures, scenes, lifestyles, tribes, tourists and travelers, Bunde, and so on, which were uncritically accumulated and presented as equally powerful and capable of encompassing all existing and future subcultural phenomena. This accumulation eventually triggered a chaos within the subcultural researcher field, and in the absence of self-criticism and self-evaluation, these concepts were left to a natural selection. Those that were used most frequently were actually the one that persisted. Although it seemed that subcultural theory is fragile and constantly overtaken by time, a consensus has emerged among academics in the new millennium to make a reconcept of the existing subcultural concept rather than seeking a new solution. The concept of subculture is retained. The prefix sub loses its lower secondary meaning, which means that subcultures appear on an equal footing with general culture, but also with youth culture, since not all young people are involved in subcultural practices. Contemporary researchers introduce symbolic interactionalism, which roughly understands society as a network of interactions through which we share common symbols. This model is particularly suited to the study of subcultures because subcultures share common meanings and thus define the boundaries by which they differ from mainstream society. The redefined definition of subculture is culturally bounded, but not closed networks of individuals who share ideas, materials, objects, and practices through interaction. The focus of research is therefore on relationships, on the constant interaction and sharing the symbols ideas, objects, and actions allow us to see how these symbols are used, how their recombination produces new cultural creation, and thus expand or creates new aspects of subculture. Last but not least, the notion of subculture has established itself as a transgenerational phenomenon. Cities has long been understood not only as a period of growing up, but also a lifelong subcultural affiliation for some people. Contemporary subcultures are diverse, often centered around specific musical genres, lifestyles, and values. The digital world has opened new possibilities for expression, making it easier for young people to connect with global subculture communities through the social networks. A review of a historical development and evolution of subcultural theory reveals the dynamic fluidity, elusiveness, and unpredictability of subcultural phenomena. All the studies, all the theories do not provide clear-cut answers, but rather a portrayal that might change over the time. Hence the wide range of concepts that are still used today to facilitate the outlining of the working of the subcultures. And now we go to the identity and the relationship. A nostalgic look back at the history of subcultures usually lead to the feeling that subcultures today are in decline. But what does that decline mean? That subcultures they no longer exist? Of course they do. That there are fewer of them? On the contrary, there are more, because since the first subcultures appeared, they have only accumulated. The decline refers to the assumption that today's subcultures are losing their originality and authenticity and the increasingly merging with the general youth in the wider culture. This is due to globalization and digitalization, which allows the rapid dissemination and commercialization of alternative ideas, thus losing their uniqueness. The internet and social networks provide access to information at the click of one mouse, reducing the need for separate subcultural communities. In addition, the dominant culture is becoming more open and inclusive, blurring the boundaries between subcultures and the wider society. So all of this, what I just read, is true, but all above also suggests that external factors are repeatedly the key to the weakening of a particular subcultural phenomenon, as if the subculture members were helpless victims of social economical change. If this were true, some subcultures would not have ever existed for the decades. Despite all the external factors and all the supermarkets of style, the survival of subculture depends above all on the strength of its member identification and ideas, or rather values, and how they are put into the practice, both in their relation of each other and in their relation outside of their cultures with the others. Contemporary identity is characterized by choice, seen in the context of more or less freely chosen options and offers. To survive, subcultural identities choose ways of constantly adopting social changes and novelties, thereby reinforcing their existence. Subcultural identity consists of self, like self-awareness, perception, thoughts, and feelings, and experiences gained through the various subcultural relationships. First relationship is externally, through the relationship between subculture and the other, with a big D, distinguishing between subculture members and non-members. And secondly, internally, through the relationship among the subcultures and their internal subculture hierarchical value structure. All these relationships are equal and not mutually exclusive. The classical theory of subcultures already emphasized the distinction between the subculture and the other. Whoever is a member of a subcultural group is insider, and whoever is not is outsider. This binary allows the member of the subculture to understand himself and see how he is understood by the others. On the other hand, it emphasizes their individuality, and on the other, their difference from other collective reference groups, or more generally, from the rest of society. The mainstream, for example, is one of the entities from which subculture members distance themselves, and this distance allows them to define and measure their cultural value. But there is always an element of a power in this differentiation. This distinction between subcultures and other is not an equal relationship, but usually presupposes the inferiority of the others. Through such discrimination differentiation, subcultures draw their map of a social world. Regardless of the feeling of the subcultural superiority, the nominal majority does not feel labeled as inferior. For example, a metalhead can be, for somebody, a fan of extreme music, And for some other person, it can be a Satan worshipper. Or, for example, rave for somebody means the timeless fusion on the dance floor, and for some other, it's always related with drug abuse. This multiplicity of labels reveals the complexity of social identity and, above all, the fact that insiders and outsiders' idea of themselves rarely, if ever, coincide. In other words, insiders and outsiders almost always have a different idea of each other, mainly because they labeled each other within their own identity boundaries. So, the conventional individual creates his or her identity within social acceptable views, norms, and values, while the subculture member also appropriates unapproved or risky values. Thus, not only the two sides have different perception of each other, but they are often negatively labeled. Subcultures may have sense of superiority over a mainstream society, but even mainstream society has too often shown contempt, anger, and unacceptance toward various subculture members in everyday life, from attributing negative characteristics to more aggressive acts such as verbal harassment, street fights, punishment in the family, at school, and harassment by the police. Attributing different characteristics is normal in everyday life. We all do it because it allows us to draw boundaries between ourselves, our group, and from the others. Subculture boundaries are ideal, typical in theory, but quite permeable in everyday life. The idea of absolute, all-encompassing subculture and belonging is somehow a romantic notion that, even in the classical subculture theory era, proved to be more a theoretical assumption than a practice in a real everyday life. Today, pure, closed subcultures do not exist. People who define themselves as members of a subculture, whose behavior and style are shaped by strict subcultural rules, and who only listen to a certain genre of music specific to their subcultures are firstly rare, and they are usually perceived by others and fellow subcultural members as conservative, unreflective, and even sometimes ridiculous. Ironically, what was perceived as authentic and homogeneous in subcultures at the time of the classical subcultural theory, is now perceived as conservative, stereotypical, and even stuffy. The other form of relationship is internal, intergroup division. Subculture members are not equal, but they are defined by the status they received and are assigned by other members of the subcultural group. Status can be inherited, for example, along the line of kinship. You can be a brother, sister, girlfriend of a member of some band, or you can be acquired, gained according to the organization and classification within subculture, like somebody is a good musician, somebody is a member of a very respected band, somebody is a promoter, has his own label, and so on. The first has weaker value and the second has stronger value, but in no case does it have an objective, permanent value. On the contrary, it's consistently changing, increasing, or decreasing in strength. It can change accordingly to activity, start to play in a musical group or organized concert events or festivals, but it can also be linked to inappropriate behavior of actions today known as a cancel culture. The criteria for assigning status and the strength of the status are cross-cutting, like old school, new school, selling out versus maintaining DIY ethic, years of membership and commitment to the scene, familiarity with the involvement in music, and so on. And often conservative or even stereotypical, especially about the gender. In this respect, there has been some significant positive shift in recent years. For example, we have like Riot Girls and various feminist festivals gave women space and voice, but everyday subcultural relations, the male alliance still dominated. In recent years, now in the large number of festivals, which are no longer just women or feminist festivals, have begun to systematically increase the number of female musicians and music groups that include female musicians, and with the popularization of gender identities, this spectrum has expanded even further. The reinforcement, reminiscent, and the introduction of the gender quota has significantly increased the number of engaged female subcultural members, but it has also raised questions about quality. Should we support because of the gender or because of the quality of the music? Status provides subcultural capital. based on the binary categories of the popularity and commonness, and it illustrates a measure of the strength or weakened of subcultural status. Subcultural capital can be objectified or embodied, and it confers status on its bearer according to the importance of the other. It is objectified in the collection of albums, magazines, in fanzines or posters, in the ownership of a suitable means of transport, appropriate and correctly worn clothes and accessories, in playing in a band or DJing, and embodied in stylish hairstyles, makeup, body modifications, and adornments like tattoos, piercing, and so on. It can also be manifested in the use of correct and up-to-date slang, and sometimes even a dance move. Members of the subculture learn what is correct and appropriate through the second nature, which is informal knowledge, rather than through the formal education, like in school. Therefore, it is very important not to exaggerate or copy the subculture style in behavior, dress, or other specificities, as nothing depletes capital more than to see someone trying too hard. As mentioned above, in classical subcultural theory, style was seen as a central measure of the authenticity, and the more original and shocking it was, the higher up the status ladder subculture member would be. The introduction of subcultural capital abolishes this and points out that the style is only one criterion of authenticity, and there is no externally determined authenticity. Authenticity does not exist in itself, it's always inherent in the object, person, or action, nor it can be achieved or negotiated in itself, still it's a process that is always ongoing, changing in space and time, requiring constant effort and evidence, and never ever reaching a final stage. Post-subculturalists have already argued that contemporary subcultures practice style surfing, moving quickly and freely from one style to another. It's all just a game of style. Style is now determined primarily by appearance, not by any hidden message behind it. The appearance is already the message. Instead of bricolage, which was one of the points of the classical theory, the focus is now on pastiche, a mixture of styles in which subculture members imitate and combine past subcultural styles, loosening their internal boundaries in the process. This thesis was born out of the emergence of electronic music, where a mixture of different, not necessary subcultural styles found themselves on the same dance floor. Moreover, the emergence of a club culture, structural divisions such as class, ethnicity, and gender on the dance floor merged into a new collective club experience. This phenomenon is now even more pronounced today on the internet and social networks, where there is a constant stream of phenomena that like to be labeled as a subculture, and mainly based on aesthetic. We have e-girls and e-boys, we have cottagecore, we have dark academia, we have vaporwave, which is more of a genre, but it's often referred as a subcultural phenomenon. The virtual world certainly allows us to play with identities. However, cultural aesthetics borrow elements from historical, literary, and subcultural sources and resemble them into cohesive, marketable looks, focusing primarily on creating an Instagram-worthy image rather than engaging with underlying cultural, ideological ideas and values. Sharing knowledge. Identity formation and the transfer of knowledge from the local network to the wider network and vice versa, maintaining the longevity of the subculture and the emergence of change and novelty takes place through the cultural nodes. The cultural nodes are social channels with a network of relationship constantly interweaving and disseminating cultural information and ways of knowing and enabling the construction of the shared universe. Communication nodes take place within the subculture itself. For example, it consists from from few small groups, for example, members of the subculture from different areas, and they provide some certain information about what is in and what is out. At the same time, subcultures are members of also other networks, such as family, a wider circle of friends, classmates, colleagues, and neighborhoods with whom they are connected by weak ties, but through whom they receive information about various phenomena and aspects. There also may be individuals and groups who play the key role, such as older subculture members who are respected and can provide guidance to the other who are younger. And the last but not least, we have the media, especially films, fanzines, social networks, and so on, who are also the nodes. For example, when I was growing up, which was a pre-digital era, of course, we all had this one friend, or a brother, or a neighbor, or a schoolmate, who would spin us that first cassette, or in my case, it was a video cassette, that captivated us, amazed us, and led us down to the certain subcultural path. Later, we got all the information within our subcultural group, at home or abroad, in the beginning mainly from the older members who already had some knowledge, but also through the micromedia such as fanzines, leaflets, posters, and nowadays blogs and social networks, and also niche media such as specialized online music magazines like Maximum Rock and Roll and of course the Quietus. As well, also we had books and documentaries made by former subculture members. The opposite of micro and niche media is macro or mass media, which often still resorts to sensationalization or moral panic when representing on subcultures. Ironically, it is usually through the mass media that youngsters first encounter subculture phenomena, and the sheer opacity of subculture is certainly one of the dimensions that attracts them. The internet has only made everything faster. The new technologies and digitalization allow young people to access the world faster than any previous generation. Cultural nodes play the role of gatekeepers, directing and transmitting subcultural knowledge and practices. So Robert was talking about streaming music services in a previous lecture, like Spotify, YouTube, and so on, which offer large selection of music and podcasts and have come under the scrutiny. Those platforms are coming under increased criticism, including disaffection with the algorithms that generate music recommendations in the artificial classification of the genres. As a result, the importance of personal contact and recommendation, the transfer of knowledge between subcultural members, and the preservation of voluntary isolation are increasingly emphasized. The transfer of knowledge takes place originally. A new member of subculture slowly gets to know the basic ideas and values, visit places, and socialize with other members who are further embodied in a particular subculture. And this is going always organically. You know, you have always these generations when youngers are coming and olders are already there, and slowly the scene is changing. But however, after COVID pandemia, there was a bit a different situation because of 2 years of not much happening in the public life, and because of the venues were closed and so on. After 2 years, there was an unexpected interaction between the older generation and the younger generation who came, who basically were strangers to each other. They didn't know each other because there was no this organic process. So for the older generation, it was a shock that how many youngsters came, and for younger generation, it seemed that they are very self-sufficient, that they learn everything from the internet, and they showed no interest in passing on subcultural knowledge. So now that we are starting to work together, especially in the field of organizing events and so on, it is necessary to adapt and gradually learn to accept each other. And this is the process now that is going on at the moment. So in the relationship of subcultures to the other, subcultural theory has always emphasized subcultural gatekeepers as a bulwark against the polluting process of commercialization and commodification. In the past, one of the most painful things for subculture members, when one of their role models, be it an individual or a music group, decided to cross the boundaries of the underground into a commercial success. To sell out meant betraying all the principles of the subculture. Today, this criteria is no longer strict, primarily because of the internet has almost eliminated the incubation period between subcultural authenticity and popularization. Modern theorists points out that any subcultural phenomena must be understood through the prism of several levels. Therefore, it is necessary to distinguish between, firstly, bands who decided, music groups that decided or have chosen a commercial and professional path. Secondly, we have some groups who maybe some members used to be, but maybe even not. They just like the genre and they decided to play this music for some time. And then we have this, what we call subculture scene, where not only music genre is important, but also a lifestyle. As such, it fosters a sense of connection and dynamic relationship on the local level, while on the global level, it creates a sense of urban cosmopolitanism. Oh, I'm sorry, I will just go further. Over longer periods of time, maintain certain shared rules that connects members transnationally. Many of today famous music groups that fill concert halls came out of particular subcultural scene. The scene gave them the place to start, supported them, and when they crossed over into the mainstream, the scene itself was not harmed. Its flexibility and dynamic also allow it to adopt it quickly. If a particular subcultural scene is solid, the mainstream will undermine it, but the scene will quickly pick itself up again. Members of the scene may be stung by fashion trends that copy certain stylistic innovations and offer them to a wider market, but by the appearance of artificially created bands that have nothing to do with a particular subcultural genre except to play it, but in the long run, this does not affect the scene. As well as adaptability, there is also a certain conservatism in the scene which preserves foundations that act as a defense against change. This, I'm sorry, I need to make. Yeah. There is also a certain conservatism in the scene which preserves foundation that acts as defense against change, thus preserving various specific tastes and habits. Again, even if subcultural scenes are now considered loose, this does not mean that they will ever disappear. As long as there are places and people who care about them, the scene will live on. And now we go to the space. Space holds certain importance as it enables a sense of freedom. It is where subculture members can experiment with identities and activities without parental and other supervision, which also, besides the music and all the other activities, means also use of drugs, alcohol, and sex. Many subcultures are tied to space. Hip-hop subculture is tied to the ghetto and its neighborhood, from which it draws inspiration and constructs a complex set of values, actions, and stylistic expressions. Skaters turn the streets into the training ground. Graffiti artists need facades and walls to display their creation. An abandoned warehouse becomes a meeting place for ravers. Trancers occupy a clearing in the middle of the forest. Punk squads enable concert venues, and so on. The importance of the space in the life of subculture is also shown by the fact that subcultures often come into the conflict with the authorities who persecute them for staying in the parks, limit the space for hooligans in stadium, ban fine graffiti, legally persecute squatting and setting up illegal electronic parties, put up obstacles for skating, and so on. There can also be a struggle for space among subcultures. For example, some subculture groups fight to defend their territory. The most famous fight was between mods and rockers in Brighton in the 60s, but you can always have fights with the football hooligans and so on. Spaces also can be characterized by a particular musical genre. For example, every time when we think about Seattle, we will think about the grunge. The hip-hop and rap scene is divided into the East and West Coast, and so on. Contemporary theory introduces the term subcultural geographies to encompass the physical and abstract spaces in which subcultures operate and how these environments shape subcultural experience. Subcultural geographies consist of the local, the translocal, and the virtual, with the addition of the global level, which some address separately. Local domains encompass concrete physical spaces, contain local specificities and cultural practices, and subculture members are directly interconnected with those boundaries. Here, subcultures are sustained through the range of activities. Concerts, fairs, and other public events have specific spaces where these activities take place, like clubs, squats, street areas, parks, and where members socialize, thereby reinforcing and nurturing the sense of belonging. Translocal consists of different local scenes that are linked by subcultural elements such as values, styles, actions, and behavior. Distances are reduced through the music in other international festivals and fairs, band tours, music labels, and so on. The virtual space, on the other hand, is a digital non-physical space in which subcultures come into a temporary or regular contact. Regular gatherings can eventually develop into virtual communities, which can also be long-lasting and based on a certain set of values and norms. The issue of transience and subcultural authenticity is often linked to the emergence of the virtual communities. Today, there is no doubt that some virtual communities exist only in digital space and that they are real, their members experiencing online interaction and subjective as original. Similarly, pre-digital subculture forms and their rules began to change or adopt with the virtual world. Some researchers add globalization to geographies as a continuous process of integration that takes place at the political, economic, and cultural levels, and that indirectly affects subcultural creations and products, like music careers, fanzines, jewelry, and so on, and appropriating and disseminating them at the same time. All levels, from local to global, are continuously intertwined through the interactions, creating localization, through which local residents utilize, appropriate, or reject translocal culture. Even subcultures are either closed local cultures or not undifferentiated global. For example, trap and rap as a genre is globally presented, but it has a local specificities. In Slovenia, it will be difficult to find text that describes street shootings and fights for territory like in the States. Slovenia has a rich history of alternative youth and self-organized venues in Ljubljana and other small towns. In the past, they formed a lively DIY network, which was primarily based on guitar music, particularly punk, but the younger squads also opened the door for some electronic collectives. This mainly depended on the affinities of the local scene. Only the late AC Molotov in Ljubljana was an exclusively punk squad, whose users were also closely linked to the anti-globalization movement. Many of these spaces have closed down or changed their programming over the years. Just as the fans of electronic music point out that there is no suitable place for their music in Ljubljana at the moment or anywhere else, the same can be said for any other subculture. So what remains? The individual concerts and parties that can take place again in clubs and youth centers as well as festivals. The club scene has its own rules, the maintenance of premises and equipment, and the monthly infrastructure costs are the burden, especially in the premises that do not receive program subsidies and grants. Often only the names of the performance and the numbers of the visitor count and DIY collides with the economic calculation, leaving little space for spontaneous and unburdened socializing. It is ironic that, for example, punks who work in the clubs and various non-punk events and commercial festivals, while maintaining and strengthening the significant portion of the overall alternative scene, simultaneously neglect their scene due to the lack of time. Spaces are intersections of meetings, socializing, and new discoveries, where the strength and the solidarity of subcultures are reinforced. The importance of space often becomes evident only when it's lost. It's hard to imagine, for example, in non-democratic countries where religious fundamentalism reigns, where that not only the subcultures do not have their own spaces, but they also are persecuted or even forced into hiding. We don't face such a repression here, but ask the ex-residents and users of Rock in Ljubljana, Inde in Koper, Argo in Izola, Friday the 13th, torej petek 13. in Železniki, Vila Mare, AC Molotov in Ljubljana, about the emptiness that they still feel. They will all recall the sense of community, which at certain point almost grow into a familiar bond among different individuals, as well as everyday anecdotes, bands that they were formed and played there, visits from foreign collectives and travelers, and so on. Few today remember exactly how many concerts and parties took place and which bands played there, but everyone will say the same: it was good. The internet today, of course, allows us to stay connected all the time, but if we learned anything from the pandemic COVID-19, is that no connection via cables can replace a personal interaction. Subcultural spaces are not just important, they are precious, and once they are lost, it's usually for good. And the last rebellion. Rebellion was a certain central theme of a classical subcultural theory, manifested as symbolic, stylistic rebellion against the parent and dominant culture, and as a fundamental way of resolving conflict. Direct political action as protest was the domain of the countercultures. Post-subculturalists depart from this concept. They claim that the subcultural heroism has ended and the rebellion no longer exists, while at the same time we have techno-collectives who have occupied the streets and turning them into party spaces, like Reclaim the Streets, and held illegal raves in warehouses opposing licensing rules. Contemporary subcultural theory goes back to the starting point and asks how subcultures express a rebellious nature in everyday life, and when it's the moment when rebelliousness is replaced by rebellious attitude. Again, the theorists introduced scales of measurement that show different forms of rebelliousness, individual or collective, according to the speciality, like micro, meso, macro, and according to the methods. Similarly, Williams defines different dimensions of subcultural resistance, passive and active, micro, macro, and covert and overt. This approaches encompasses the full range and intensity of resistance from, veganism, second-hand exchange, illegal techno parties, to the banners on the street. Certain subcultures are involved in the politicization of everyday life, such as cross-punks or New Age travelers who sympathize with anarchism, practice DIY through music and art, and community life, but also subcultures that shape their everyday actions based on racism and intolerance, like Nazi skinheads and the white power movements. Marchand says that subcultures become political when they leave the obscurity of the clubs and enter the light of the public sphere. Subcultures are not social protest movements. Rather, they join such movements at certain times. To achieve this, they have to transcend their interest, rise above the subcultural sphere, and link it up with other social groups, and only then can they universalize their demands. In recent years, there were anti-government protests that was before today's government in Slovenia. Today, we have anti-war protests against the war in Ukraine and genocide in Palestine. The queer platform and collective Ustanova has been active in Ljubljana for several years, constantly challenging and questioning gender identities and divisions in their electronic events, while also incorporating current global issues into their events, like lately calling to ceasefire in Gaza. The collective also organized the annual Grounded Festival, a festival of electronic music, critical thinking, and activism that addresses current social issues. In parallel, there are several smaller actions and events with a political dimension. The annual Antifa Festival this year raised money for medical aid for Palestinians, and for the third year in a row, the feminist punk concert Punch took place, with the money raised going to the safe houses of Slovenia. Footnote bombs and outer markets are still going strong. Social movements always comes in waves. In periods of stagnation, it may seem that movement or scene is dead, while in reality, subcultures and countercultures maintain the connectivity and longevity of the social network through festivals, concerts, online networks, and so on. In these periods of stagnation, one of the most important principles is DIY, or do-it-yourself, which in generally counters today's hyper-commercialization. DIY essentially means an approach where people create, repair, or adapt things themselves rather than relying on a professional service or mass production. This principle was transformed by punk movement into ideology of demystifying the production process of industrial mass culture by promoting independence, self-productivity, self-initiative to express their values and resistance to commercialization. While Live Nation has monopole on the music industry, when you can hardly book a band without a music agency, the existence of independent DIY venues, independent promoters, self-organized bands and DJs, small independent labels are important. The principle also encourages resistance to mass production and consumerism with the swap shops, repair shops, and DIY markets. DIY is the backbone of resistance to the monetizing of the modern society. The greatest enemy of subculture is not commodification, but is the relativization of values and principles within the subcultures themselves. Not long ago, A small DIY stage was set up at the commercial festival in the sense that the initiator of the stage brought his musical equipment and organized concerts. The bands that responded to the invitation played for free in the DIY spirit. Noble, one might say. If all this had not taken place within a framework of a commercial festival for which day ticket holders had to pay a considerable price and also, of course, multi-day visitors even more, and which included expensive hospitality and other facilities. Subcultures changed meanings and introduced alternative values from the dominant culture to improve society, not to validate it. Political attitudes, whether symbolically expressed by the Visco reusable bottle, promoters and music bands who are rejecting Spotify, or the DIY benefit event, regardless of their intensity or reach, seek to improve the world around us. The relativization of values turns subcultures into a hobby and a range of styles, consumers looking for entertainment and relief from the mundane. As mentioned at the beginning, the scene is and it will be the way we co-create it ourselves. So the main question still remains, are we going to be part of the scene or a scenery? Thank you very much.
Questions from the audience, maybe? If not, let's meet in 15 minutes for the final lecture of today.
Electric Wizards, a tapestry of heavy music, 1968 to the present. So I thought I would introduce some of its themes, why I wrote it, some of the choices that were made in putting it together, some reactions to it, and that kind of thing. The subtitle to the book was quite important in regards to indicating to the reader what might be lying between its pages, with the caveat in brackets that it does contain several metal bands and albums and scenes. It is explicitly a book about heavy music, not solely about heavy metal. I should probably point out here that I don't have anything against heavy metal. While I've never been a kind of full-bore, card-carrying metalhead myself, I can fully understand why somebody would sign themselves up to that particular cause. You know, maybe I have some issues with heavy metal in the broadest terms. For me, with my critic hat on, I find that quite a lot of the less interesting metal that's around these days can be a bit too standardised and performative. This can apply to pyrotechnics wielding arena fillers down to a black metal band dressed as spooky trees in a grotty basement. Often there can be an off-putting amount of testosterone on display as well. I don't see why all those guitarists have to employ as wide a stance as is physically possible to play their manly solos. They will only risk a groin injury. As I say in the book, when too much thought and effort has gone into showing off, either musically or costume-wise, or in other theatrical ways, it can distract from or impede the heaviness of the performance rather than serving to enhance it. As is the case with other genres as well, an awful lot of metal bands also seem to take themselves more seriously the bigger that they get, despite metal being sort of inherently ridiculous and over the top. That's partly why, out of the so-called Big Four American thrash bands, Metallica, Slayer, Megadeth and Anthrax, I'm particularly fond of the latter. Anthrax are a bit silly. They're slightly flawed. They don't take themselves that seriously. They're the underdogs of that gang, and they don't pretend that they're not having fun. Having said that, I'm quite partial to post-metal, and that can get quite pretentious. These views might help to explain why I included 5 pages on Lou Reed and Metallica's divisive double album Lulu, which I genuinely adore, without irony, and mentioned 1986's groundbreaking Master of Puppets only in passing, much to the horror of certain readers. But at the end of the day, who really needs another straightforward history of heavy metal? It's been done time and time again. Heavy music, I think, possibly less so, if at all. Metal does not have a monopoly on heaviness. Heavy music is a broad church. I have Catholic tastes. There are lots of different ways to approach and achieve what you or I might deem to be true heaviness. A general history of heavy metal might start in a similar place to where my book does, with the blues, rock and roll, the Beatles, Black Sabbath, and then it might rattle through Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple before taking in the leathery sights and meticulously recorded sounds of Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, Metallica, and maybe from there explore thrash metal, death metal, black metal, glam metal, groove metal, and other later developments. So I decided a different path was in order for perhaps a fresher narrative on the evolution of heaviness. The contents sort of, well, I'll show you the content. There we go. I'm not going to go through all of this, don't worry. It's sort of presented in a broadly chronological manner, although it's also arranged thematically, and there are kind of overlaps as you go along in terms of what happened when. So what I threw into the mix with this was, including sections on acid rock, funk, krautrock, and similar European experimental music in the 70s, post-punk, industrial rock, noise rock, grunge, stoner rock, noise music, particularly in the sort of early 2000s, although it does go a lot further back than that. Post-rock and post-metal as well. Seemed to make sense to call this a tapestry rather than a history, so that I could kind of attempt to tie more closely together a bunch of connected but perhaps seemingly disparate threads. I did name the book then after a heavy metal band, which in retrospect might have been misleading to some customers. The Dorset Doom band Electric Wizard, and particularly their third studio album, Dope Throne, from the year 2000, they appear in the chapter there alongside Earth, Sleep, and what I call other assorted stoners, such as desert rock groups like Caius. Electric Wizards, in the plural, was a phrase that helped to group together all my selected practitioners of heavy music. Electric is there because when all is said and done, loud amplification is pretty crucial to the foundations of heavy music. Whereas Wizards, I think, suggests that there remains a more elusive alchemy going on in the creation of the sound or these records that's maybe a little harder to pin down or figure out or summarise in any real watertight manner. Sir Paul McCartney, who I'll get to in more detail later, has always been reluctant to learn too much about music or to know everything about it, to become too skilled at it or to dwell on its secrets in any great depth himself, lest it ruin what he calls the magic of music making. For this reason, McCartney never learned to read music notation. I think there is still a magic to heavy music that does remain mysterious, no matter how much fun it is to write about it and analyse its various aspects in significant detail. We can get closer to unlocking its secrets, but I rather like the idea that we'll never perhaps quite get to the bottom of it, or to the bottom of it all. There are scholars studying heavy music who are able to dig deeply into analysing sonic frequencies and the minutiae of production processes in very precise detail, with vast technical expertise. Although even their books and articles can often seem fairly subjective in terms of the choices made, the examples used, and the areas explored. Not that I have any problem with subjectivity. As one member of the public posted on the Marvellous Goodreads website after reading Electric Wizards, it seemed like a lot of this book was just an excuse for the author to talk about bands and artists he really likes. You know, guilty as charged to a certain extent. That being said, there are heavy bands who I adore that were left out of the book for the sake of the arguments and the narrative. Others who I'm perhaps a little less keen on personally, whose inclusion seem to be merited on account of their undeniable impact and reach. Needs must and difficult decisions had to be made. What I tried to do was to home in on noteworthy acts whose work has stood and is likely to continue to stand the test of time. These ranged from household names to obscure occult heroes and heroines. The overriding idea was to extol those who did things differently, who introduced something fresh, new and exciting into the world of heavy, whether by calculated design, slight accident or sheer chance. Often these developments involved taking an approach that ran counter to conventional thinking and popular trends. For that reason, many of the artists covered in the book took a little while to catch on with the public. Others are still waiting for the wider appreciation that they no doubt properly deserve. Some of the acts that I wrote about made their creative breakthroughs by combining formally separated elements and ideas. Others took known heavy methods to their even heavier logical conclusions. At the same time, then, I hope to show how each successive phase in what I call heaviness was forged by what came before, and to join the dots between musicians whose connections may at first seem distant or perhaps a little surprising. In doing so, it was my hope to broaden the scope of what we mean when we talk about heavy music, which kinds of music and musicians are merited for inclusion in such a category. Having made the case for eclecticism there, I did keep things more or less restricted to material that is at roots guitar-based. Much as I would have liked to have tumbled further down the rabbit hole to explore genres like techno, drill and bass, the rest of it, there just wasn't the space permitted to do it in. I did manage to squeeze some discussion of electronic music into the book, including, of all places, the chapter on Scum, the 1987 debut album by Napalm Death. They're another metal band, I suppose, and one contender for the heaviest band of all time. We can discuss other contenders later on. It wasn't ever intended to be a comprehensive chronicle of all heavy music. What single volume could possibly accomplish that mighty feat? Naturally, as I say, the topic is highly subjective and the definition of heaviness itself is open to many interpretations. What does or does not constitute heavy music, what it is and what it is not, these matters are in constant cultural flux and likewise deeply personal. Yes, I am offering my own version of the development of heavy music. Yours could be quite different. It might be a bit weird if we shared the exact same views, and I'd much prefer to see this book as the opening of a conversation rather than any kind of arrogant final word on the subject. Before becoming a music journalist, I trained as a historian. Hence the dry delivery of my lectures. Now, before becoming a music journalist, I trained as a historian, and one of the earliest things we studied when I started my history degree was the importance of historiography, right? And the idea that any history is shaped by the individual who wrote it, the time in which they were living, their prior and surrounding historical contexts. This applies whether you call your history a tapestry or not. So this was my version of the origins and evolutions of heavy music, and it was, for better or worse, shaped by where I am from, when I was born, who I grew up with, etc. As you can probably see, there is a kind of Anglo-American bias to the content, I suppose. Despite the parts that draw on different areas of Europe, as well as Japan and Australia. Well, of course, I warmly welcome future work on unsung offerings from elsewhere around the globe. And I also never wanted to suggest that all important heavy music is made by groups consisting of 3 or 4 white men, although I suppose a lot of those do appear. That is one of the reasons why I was keen to include a whole chapter on funk, though, in which I was able to talk about Sly and the Family Stone's appearance at the Woodstock Festival, Betty Davis's Kinky Grooves, draw connections between the philosophies of George Clinton and Miles Davis and Neil Young and Crazy Horse. I won't go into that in vast detail now, but have a look at that chapter if it interests you. I would say that if the links between funk and other genres, heavy genres, are in any doubt, then if you spend as much time as I have interviewing bands for platforms like the Quietus, Bandcamp Daily, The Wire, and others, you'll notice that when talking to heavy music makers, more often than not, there are a bunch of Parliament and/or Funkadelic LPs lurking proudly behind them in the background of the Zoom video call. Something I have noticed. Recently, I found myself conducting some research into the germ of an idea for a potential future music book, and I stumbled on a text which delved into the scientific arguments that suggested there is no free will. Along with what I was just saying about historiography, this gave me a funny feeling of solace in the sense that it suggested that Electric Wizards could never have been any different from how it turned out in the end. It also absolved me from the responsibility of any of the other supposed decisions, better or worse, that I've ever made in the course of my life. However, I'm not sure where that leaves me the next time I'm critiquing any given band's latest shoddy album for the Quietus website or Record Collector magazine. Hackney Diamonds is not the worst album the Rolling Stones could have released in 2023, or the best album the Rolling Stones could have released in 2023. It is the only record the remaining members of the Rolling Stones could have released in 2023, given that everything we and they do is dictated by everything that has occurred prior, and the electrical impulse that initiates action occurs half a second before anybody takes the conscious decision to act. Anyway. If you're going to write a book about heavy music, then you're going to need to provide a handy definition of it, pretty early on in the text, and it helps if it's useful enough for your intended purposes and perhaps also loose enough to allow the author to write about all the bands and artists he really likes. So this is what I plumped for my handy definition of heavy. Again, you might not agree. A combination of sonic power and sincere emotion of all kinds and within various genres, performed by those who value texture and density of sound above conventional technical prowess. While the world of heaviness is vast and varied, it tends to be about riffs, thickness of sound, often via distortion, deep and bassy. It is almost always made by an ensemble, be this 2 people or more, who create their sound as a cohesive unit, not as a conduit to underscore the talents of one spotlight-hogging star singer or player. Music that relies too much on virtuosity and showboating, in my own view, risks losing, obscuring, or diminishing the purity and soulfulness of its heaviness. There is, to be fair, a thin line between rapturous, transcendental guitar solo and showing off guitar solo, between shamanism, if you like, and emotionally empty onanism. And yes, different listeners will have very different ideas of where that line might lie. For me, guys, and it is usually guys, like Dave Gilmour, Jimmy Page, Joe Satriani, allow themselves too often to sink headfirst into the latter category, whereas on the other hand, Dinosaur Jr.'s Jay Mascis, Eddie Hazel and Michael Hampton of Parliament Funkadelic, Elisa Ambrosio of Magic Markers, and Neil Young and Crazy Horse are the real deal. A useful example is Dean Ween. On the left there, who sometimes appears in lists of most underrated guitarists. This is because he plays in the oddball band Ween, known for their Zappa-like parodies, eccentric humour and eclectic straddling of musical styles. Dina, real name Michael Melchiondo Jr., is an accomplished player, but Ween are also followers of the demon god Bognič, you can see behind him there, or so they say, and are advocates of what they refer to as the brown sound. This is roughly defined by them as, quote, fucked up in a good way. For Ween producer Andrew Weiss, the brownness of the sound often arises from unorchestrated, glorious mistakes, such as the strangled tone that a distortion pedal might croak out when its battery is fading. In the early days of recorded music, distortion itself was initially viewed as a sonic aberration, a mistake that needed to be contained, corrected and eliminated in order to achieve as crisp and clean a sound as was humanly and technically possible. That was until people cottoned on to the fact that distortion sounds really cool. This oral smudge, this happy side effect, this leaking wrongness became a defining element of first the electric blues and subsequently much rock and metal music as a whole. In terms of showing off, and perhaps this is counterintuitive, but guitar players who are less technically accomplished can have the edge over more experienced and dexterous musicians. Steve Turner there from the from Mudhoney, the Stooges smitten grunge band Mudhoney, has said that having grown gradually but noticeably better at playing guitar from years of touring and recording, he now battles with trying to unlearn what he knows so that Mudhoney don't risk losing their shambolic rawness. I was always under the idea that progress on the guitar was the enemy of good rock and roll, Turner would later explain. So I never tried to be a better guitar player, but you can't help but get better. And by playing so many acoustic shows by myself, I know I have done. With Mudhoney, I try to forget most of my knowledge. I just try to dumb it down, and I don't mean that cynically. It's great to get lost in the sound and not think about it too much. Get lost in sound, don't get lost in technique. Thrash metal millionaires Metallica may have been searching for something similar when in one of their regular bouts of identity crisis, they recorded 2003 Saint Anger. Uncharacteristically for Metallica, this album featured 0 guitar solos. The reception was mixed. Although favourable critics found it captured the band sounding groovier, more stripped back and more pissed off than they had done in years. There I go again, praising a Metallica album that few other people seem to enjoy. The heaviest music typically has a low art grubbiness and a rawness to it, if you like. Relatively cheap to make and ramshackle in nature, it glories in its own messiness and imperfections. Its artists are usually averse to glossy, clean, overly manipulated and archly commercial production and live mixing techniques. They give the impression of searching for something intangible, mystical in the rehearsal, recording and recital of this music. Catharsis, release, meditation, freedom, whatever it may be, rather than simply wishing to attract adoration and applause and riches. They are, as Julian Cope would have it, on a prolonged shamanic search for sonic obliteration. They are not the electric mechanics, the electric brain surgeons, or the electric Cirque du Soleil acrobats. They are the electric wizards. Now, as well as objecting to my enjoyment of all the wrong Metallica records, there were readers who complained about the following issue. I don't like that he occasionally spends a paragraph or two arbitrarily shitting on bands he doesn't like, as one reader put it. Okay. I mean, it is a little less arbitrary than you might assume, because ignoring my previously raised potential lack of free will, which we'll put on the back burner for now, good music, brackets or music I like, exists in the context of its surrounding worse music, brackets music I dislike. One of the bugbears of my life as a writer and as a reader of music journalism is that music criticism has become noticeably less critical since I was growing up, to a far greater degree than equivalent writing on other subjects. Restaurant reviews, for example, reviews of ropey television shows or architecture. There are numerous reasons for this disparity, including the collapse of traditional revenues available to both musicians and those who write about them, impact of social media, etc. I'm not saying there was a golden age of music journalism, because a lot of what qualified for supposedly biting music criticism back in the day was frankly riddled with prejudice and bigotry of various unsavoury natures. Quite a lot of what passes for music criticism at the moment, however, lacks the same amount of irreverence, cheekiness, humour, sheer entertainment value that made me fall in love with reading about music in the first place and then later writing about it. And none of those qualities that I've just listed there, it should be noted, are mutually exclusive from providing genuine insight and analysis at the same time. I found a lot of music journalism has become, to all intents and purposes, virtually indistinguishable from PR and marketing copy. And it's less well paid than those gigs, so if that's your bag, you might as well pivot to copywriting or similar, as many of us do. If you look at certain magazines' review sections, crammed as they are with glowing 4- and 5-star write-ups, they're beginning to resemble a record industry equivalent of a shopping catalogue. You could say the same about various puff-piece interview features, although I think with that format, maybe empathy is more important, I think, unless it's an encounter with the unpleasant person that Morrissey has become. We are all complicit in this dampening, but in the most basic terms, if you say everything is brilliant all of the time, then it becomes fairly meaningless. You lose credibility as an arts critic. Negative reviews, even constructively critical ones, have become such a rarity these days that a lot of readers and musicians, and even certain writers as well, can't begin to comprehend why anybody would even write one in the first place. A result of this is when they do happen to come across one of the few negative reviews that are still published, they react with anger and frothy-mouthed disbelief, which they can now aim directly at the writer via social media. And this response also puts writers off writing any more of them. It is ridiculous, really, because people's tastes and opinions, as I keep saying, are obviously subjective. But I still take it quite personally, as I always have done, when the lamest bands with the biggest marketing budgets behind them become monstrously successful, while maverick talents with miserable day jobs slave away with negligible recognition and scant material reward. Among other things, music journalism and literature, which I'll return to in a second, can attempt to redress that imbalance if it wants to. Lots of people see us as elitist snobs, but I like to think that, as with satire and other areas of the press, the best music writing has an egalitarian and anti-hierarchical purpose. I try to raise that point in my faintly infamous 2020 review of Idol's dreadful third album, For the Quietus, and some of their fans threatened to harass me at my home. I even saw one fellow music journalist accuse me, though not directly at me via social media, of punching down. Idols are currently one of the biggest bands in the United Kingdom, so if I'm punching down, then that must make me the 11th Duke of Richmond. There are many writers who simply don't want to inject further negativity into an already depressingly negative world, which is completely understandable. On a planet in which there is so much more music readily accessible to us than ever before, some writers now have the personal policy, and there are magazines with the same editorial policy, that they would rather lift commendable music up out of the quagmire of noise than spend their precious time knocking anything down. Okay, that's one positive way to try to address the fact that some of the naffest bands in the world are packing out arenas while the best are struggling to draw numbers in the back room of a pub round the corner from the same arena. As I said before, I trained as a historian, and I wonder whether we risk misleading those in the future who will look back and try to make sense of our time and our culture, and thus how it's all going to be remembered. In 2017, I interviewed Steve Albini, who's sadly died earlier this year. My book has a whole chapter on Albini due to his approach to recording music, his own bands, also his attitude and opinions, and his influence on all sorts of ways on countless heavy music makers the world over. I won't get into that now, but so in 2017, I was interviewing him about the discography of his band Shellac. And after a while, when I'd asked him about the way their second album seemed to be less positively reviewed than their debut, and the way their aggressive third album was written about in the press, he became a little bit frustrated and asked me, "Why are you so obsessed with how everything is received? All our albums were received perfectly well by the three people who made them." All right, fair enough. I'm a music journalist who reads a lot of music journalism, was my answer. I take his point about musicians with integrity only really needing to satisfy themselves. But people like me have to consider the wider world outside those three people and think about the bigger or the wider picture. I bring this up because in the olden days you could look at the charts for a picture of what millions of people were listening to, and then you could also look to the music press for an alternative, persuasive, and still widely believed view about how flawed or annoying that same music was. When the so-called gatekeepers or cultural commentators increasingly sing from the same hymn sheet as the cold numbers, then people are going to look back on our era and think that everybody in the world loved and lapped up everything that was ever released by Charlie XCX, for example. But that simply isn't the reality. Incidentally, it's no good saying that every time a U2 album comes out that it's a return to form, because if you said that about the last album and then the one before that, etc., then there are publications that do this. Then when did U2's form ever waver? In his book about a lifetime of watching motion pictures, Todd McEwen claims that in the end there'll be nothing left. No movies, nothing electronic. So that descriptions of movies in books is all the saucer men will have access to. That's if books even survive. But perhaps this applies to music as well, and what we're going to be telling the saucer men in the future who go through what is being left behind. Now, you could say that taking pot shots at certain crappy bands is the kind of impudent practice that should be contained to magazine and website copy, although, as I repeat, there's not much of it in those places anymore either. But maybe you could say that books hold a slightly different and more elevated position in popular culture. In fact, that's almost exactly what my editor said after he'd read one of the early drafts for Electric Wizards. "Be very careful about describing bands or artists in less than favourable terms," he wrote to me. "There is a much lower threshold for offence in books than in journalism, in my experience. And in any case, I think it's best to avoid too much negative description. I've made several cuts, but be alert to this when you run through again." My editor, who had my back throughout the entire process and beyond, seemed concerned that I may have risked libelling someone in print, although he didn't explicitly say who that might be. Could have been the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Maybe it was Marilyn Manson. Suffice to say, for the reader who didn't like it when I apparently arbitrarily took a pop at either of those parties, you should have seen the state of the text, prior to publication. I won't repeat any of the lines that were seamlessly edited out here either, just in case. Ask me about it afterwards if you like, off the record. So as well as containing the odd paragraph on stuff I don't like, I also include a chapter about the era I decided was heaviness's lowest point. Namely the late 90s and early 2000s. Feel free to skip that chapter if you wish, to avoid the negativity. In those pages on the nadir, I discuss Britpop's war against shoegaze, grunge and the riot girl scene, not to mention its sinister flag-waving parochialism. Also included in that period was the so-called loudness war, which led to overly compressed and therefore horrible-sounding records, which Greg Milner discusses in much greater detail in his book Perfecting Sound Forever. Nu metal also became gigantically popular at the time. Both Britpop and nu metal were so dominant that they temporarily sucked much that surrounded into their gravitational pull. Some heavier British rock bands and weirder shoegaze bands cut their hair, wore trendier shirts, jumped on the bandwagon and hired orchestras to emulate Whatever by Oasis. Others were ostracised by the media, so brilliant bands like McCluskey and Part Chimp were forced to operate much further under the radar. The Wild Hearts and Therapy suddenly sounded like they'd lost their minds in reacting against the mainstream by releasing extremely noisy and abstract albums and thereby self-sabotaging their own careers. In the States, Slayer and Machine Head started rapping like the nu metalers who were momentarily massive. James Hetfield of Metallica announced that metal needed to go away sometimes. In its place, he was enjoying the moody sound of Radiohead's OK Computer. The same band's song, The Bends, was covered by Anthrax in a fairly faithful fashion, an unnervingly faithful fashion, I would say. So, yeah, it was a very weird and not exactly fertile time for heaviness. So, as much as it seemed to certain readers that this book was an excuse for me to write about a bunch of bands that I like, I didn't want to just go, and here's another brilliant heavy band, and here's another brilliant heavy band, and here's another brilliant heavy band, and here's another brilliant heavy band. As I say, and I realise this isn't the most nuanced way of putting it, but good stuff only takes place in the context of bad stuff, and it can be useful to compare and contrast the two, and there's no shame in calling out that which is cynically produced, has a malign impact, or rips off the work of prior mavericks to greater financial reward than that received by those who ploughed the furrow. Speaking of ripping people off, or borrowing at least, I would advise anyone writing a book to have similar books in mind to act as inspiration. Songwriters do this too. They, try to write a song in the style of one or two other songwriters, and if you're not plagiarising them too closely, then usually a part of yourself will be in there as well, and it'll resemble something different to the original blueprint. So for me, there were three main books that I had in mind when writing my own. I like to plug other people's books as well as my books. Julian Cope's Copendium, which is kind of thematically linked to mine. He also writes about interesting examples of weird heavy music, some of which I also covered. Although his approach is more episodic rather than narrative. Because it's basically, I don't know if you've read it, but it's basically a chronologically arranged collection of his fervently composed album reviews. In terms of the inspiring the narrative that I hope to construct, I would look to Rob Young's Electric Eden. That might also be where electric was coming into my brain. which tells a story of British folk music in quite a sort of imaginative and exciting and detailed and distinctive way. I was also thinking about Bob Stanley's Yeah, 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 which is a huge book about pop music, and perhaps trying to write heavy music's equivalent of that. I'm not sure that's how it ended up once I was done with it. Bob Stanley's one of those writers, like Will Ashton or David Hepworth, who can write very, very short chapters that are still somehow packed with immense insight and originality. There are certainly times when I'm more prone to digression, which I like to think is entertaining digression, although I can see why it isn't for some readers. I can also be guilty of trying to pack almost every idea I can think of into a text. Hence the big book. Anyway, you have to start your narrative somewhere. Where does one begin a history or a tapestry, I should say, of heavy music? Richard Wagner suggested the writer Rob Chapman at one point in the proceedings, but going that far back seemed less feasible than including a chapter on techno. At some point after the invention of amplification in the 20th century seemed a more achievable plan. I'd have to skip over the earlier symphonic wizards to stay focused on the electric ones. Plus, I'm not sure any of Wagner's contemporaries ever described his music as heavy. I might be wrong, but I don't think so. On that note, I found it quite fun to look into the etymology of heavy as a description. Before it was applied to rock music, heavy was common term among hippies who had inherited it themselves from earlier beat writers and jazz musicians. The word was used to indicate profundity or depth, something that was especially thought-provoking or meaningful, or else it could refer to potency in terms of feelings or sentiment. When John Lennon of the Beatles sang the words "She's so heavy" in infatuation with Yoko Ono, he was not referring to his partner's physical weight as calculated on the couple's white bathroom scales. The connotations of heavy could be both positive and negative. Whoa! Dr. Leary's lecture was heavy, man, enthusiastic hippie students might have said to one another after having their minds blown by the celebrity LSD-promoting professor. When the same hippies' commune had imploded because of relationship tensions born of free love complications and internal power plays, its habitants might then have fled the sorry situation, bemoaning how the scene had got too heavy, dude. The term heavy rock emerged in the 1960s in reference to bands that used loudly amplified electric guitars, which often had a distorted tone and were backed by noticeably hard-hitting rhythm sections. Judging from the examples of music journalism in the Rock's Back Pages digital archive, heavy was initially only used to describe the most physically demanding instrument, the drums, as in a really heavy beat. Rock and roll with a heavy beat is pretty much gone, claimed the singer Bobby V towards the end of 1961, without quite knowing quite how wrong he would be. I don't believe people are aware of the change, he continued. What we do now is still called rock and roll, but it's much less raucous. In 1963, the Beatles were more likely to be described as suffering from heavy colds, as reported twice that year in the New Musical Express, than they were in dabbling in heavy music. The following year, Brian Poole of the Tremolos described a couple of his band's new numbers as beaters with a fairly heavy rock sound, but a nice melody. As the decade progressed, heavy was used to describe other individual musical aspects besides those made by drummers. Pete Staples of the Trogs seemed to stand out for his heavy, uncompromising and thunderous bass playing. With the rise of other raucous acts like the Yardbirds and the Who, the term heavy rock became common, often used interchangeably with hard rock. The term heavy metal only emerged later. Birmingham's Black Sabbath were for quite a while referred to as a heavy rock band like any other. In Sabbath's early years, people were even happy to lump them in with the contemporary prog rock scene, something that would be considered an act of categorical madness nowadays. Although it is true that Black Sabbath were friends with Yes, and guitarist Tony Iommi did play a couple of concerts in a short-lived lineup of Jethro Tull. Back then, as at any time thereafter, heavy without the metal appendage was open to interpretation. In 1969, for example, Melody Maker hailed The Nice as Britain's heaviest group, repeating the claim that future Emerson, Lake and Palmer member Keith Emerson was the Jimi Hendrix of the organ. Could such a prospect come anywhere near the heaviness of Hendrix himself, though, who back then was still alive and gigging frequently? Jimi Hendrix, he's the Jimi Hendrix of the guitar. In the summer of 2020, one of the readers of Record Collector magazine wrote to the letters page to insist that Steve Marriott's Humble Pie back in the early 70s were by far the loudest band he had ever seen, surpassing the admirable efforts of AC/DC or Deep Purple. It's worth bearing in mind, though, that while any kind of music can be played at an excessive volume, the surplus power of heaviness relies on other factors as well. There are lots of different ways for musicians to make heavy music, whether it remains packaged within verse-chorus verse structures, as in the style of the self-proclaimed ear-bleeding country band Dinosaur Jr., or breaks free of structure almost entirely, as in the abstract work of Earth. Heaviness tends to be about the sound rather than the song. Heaviness requires intensity, yes, but it is often accompanied by complementary looseness. As I said before, you have to start somewhere. And despite everything I've just said about rebalancing matters, offering fresh perspectives, and not focusing solely on four white blokes playing rock music, I did start the book by claiming that as chief architect of Helter Skelter by the Beatles, Paul McCartney invented modern heavy music in 1968. The Wire magazine deemed this to be massively problematic in an otherwise glowing review. To be fair, I do go back and discuss precursors to Helter Skelter as well, and I was kind of being a bit sort of provocative and facetious in starting that way. I do spend quite a lot of time thinking about Paul McCartney. That's who my next book is about, if I can just plug that as well. The Beatles did so many popular music firsts on record, so they might as well have launched heaviness too. First is no doubt putting it too strongly, but I do think that Helter Skelter is an undeniably important song, and it does seem to echo forward through the later material that I covered. I probably know how the story goes. Paul McCartney was casually flicking through a music magazine when he stumbled upon an interview in which Pete Townsend claimed that that his group, The Who, had just finished making the raunchiest, loudest, most ridiculous rock and roll record you've ever heard. We think that he's talking about I Can See for Miles. Paul McCartney decided that he wasn't having that and set about creating what he thought would truly be the loudest, noisiest, and most ridiculous rock track yet. It might be fair to say that John Lennon's own attempt to do heavy on that same double album's Year Blues doesn't quite succeed in transcending the grade of half-jokey pastiche. In contrast, McCartney's Helter Skelter sits on a higher plane, not to mention a step above the rock templates that preceded it. It's taken from an album that is rich in pastiche and parody, or at least tracks that take pastiche as their starting point before being sprinkled with some original Beatles magic. Helter Skelter, I don't think, is one of those compositions. McCartney's competing against a description of heaviness and what that might sound like in his mind, rather than lampooning or paying homage to any specific prior songs or artists. This is one of the signifiers that on an album that flirted with calypso, doo-wop, music hall, and other musical bricolage, Helter Skelter pointed forwards instead of concerning itself with the past. The track's uniqueness was apparent in the trouble that reviewers of the White Album had in describing and categorising Helter Skelter. Record Mirror cited the screaming, pained vocals and ear-splitting buzz guitar among the song's general instrumental confusion, and the reviewer wrote that the song's ending apparently sounded like 5,000 large electric flies out for a good time. In the International Times, Barry Miles called it probably the heaviest rocker on plastic today, while others compared it to Cream or Hendrix. Notwithstanding the undeniably powerful song part of the composition, a key element of Helter Skelter is that almost half the track's running time consists of the prolonged outro and numerous false endings, whereas a more traditionally minded blues rock outfit might have instinctively used that extra space to shred out some technically proficient solo or instrumental flourishes. The Beatles took the more uncompromising and avant-garde route of wallowing in weird noises, brassy skronk work, wild screams and enraptured riffing. Oasis's Noel Gallagher, of all people, once insisted that Helter Skelter marked the beginning of punk because its attitude and approach were absorbed by the MC5 and the Stooges, whose debut albums were both released in 1969, and they in turn influenced the punk bands who formed a little later. Punk would play a critical role in the history of heaviness, even though, as I see it, there's quite a lot of punk that tends not to be particularly heavy in itself. We can argue about that afterwards as well. In fact, the impact of Helter Skelter stretches far further and wider than is implied by its proto-punk credentials. The Who and rival hard rock outfits were required to up their game accordingly after Helter Skelter had revealed compositions like I Can See for Miles to be relatively timid in comparison. Musically speaking, the song's reliance on power and groove and its confrontationally non-conventional and spontaneously arranged structure share much with the later tropes of noise rock, maybe even also the higher brow subgenre of post-metal. The guitar scroll and the experimental brass racket that occurs at around the 3-minute mark could have come straight out of a later no-wave or post-punk track. The absence of a traditional pop rock arrangement in favour of minimalist instrumental repetition, and the idea that talented musicians could retreat back to playing in a more primal way, one that emphasised texture and feeling. Those were techniques that would be echoed in the agendas of the 1970s krautrock scene. The 13-minute outtake of Helter Skelter, which finally saw the light of day thanks to the 2018 deluxe edition of the White Album, is even more krautrock-like. It's slower and calmer than the official version, but it wallows gloriously in repetition, anticipating the ideas of Can, who formed in Cologne in the same year as the White Album's release. What's more, Ringo's yelp of "I got blisters on my fingers" at the end of the song anticipates the snippets of in-studio chit-chat that in the late 1980s, Steve Albini would include in the gaps between tracks on records such as Slint's Tweez and Pixie's Surfer Rosa. That burning desire of Paul's to create the loudest and most ridiculously raucous music ever recorded, and to push his drummer to the physical limits in doing so, shares the spirit and intentions of the 1980s grindcore pioneers Napalm Death, whose heaviness, as I say, has rarely been exceeded. Choosing not to fill one whole side of an LP with the longest take of Helter Skelter was, I think, a missed opportunity. Imagine how perfect the White Album could have been if the best Beatle had been bold enough to put his foot down by trimming away some of the double album's weaker contributions to make room for the near-mythical take of Helter Skelter that is said to be 27 minutes long. For the time being, that remains locked away still in the Abbey Road vaults, so we can only speculate on its nature. Does it take the form of an epic stoner jam that resembles the doom, drone and sludge rock subgenres that would slowly evolve out of the mere 4-minute, 30-second embryo of Helter Skelter via Black Sabbath and various mutations thereafter? Had this extended half-hour version of Helter Skelter been released in 1968, would we have witnessed records like those made by Earth, Sleep and Electric Wizard crawl out of heaviness's primordial soup much earlier than the 1990s? A wild and intoxicated session that resulted in a single track that ran for nearly 30 minutes, blood splattered across the drum skins spilled from the blistered digits of a drummer who was instructed to just beat the shit out of the drums, just kill them. A lead guitarist who was running around the studio holding a flaming ashtray atop his head in impersonation of the crazy world of Arthur Brown. While all that unhinged revelry was occurring, the singer was recording a succession of increasingly frenzied vocal takes. A bass, or two basses are on it, I think, that sounds of it's trying to trepan its way through the listener's skull. A quartet trying to recapture the magic of playing live music together as a bona fide rock band, having retired from concert performances because they could not hear themselves over the screams of their own fans. A group that was moving away from the studio experiments of their mid-1960s LPs in favour of capturing a more rough and ready feeling to their recordings. It doesn't get much rougher or more ready or more live feeling than Helter Skelter. This went beyond blues and blues rock, beyond hard rock, and into other places entirely. I was also going to add a bit here to wind things up that related to downwardness. The lyrics to Helter Skelter on face value concern going down a slide and then back up again, but mostly coming down. McCartney later said that it was a metaphor about the inevitable collapse of all empires, the fall, the demise, the going down. And one wonders, in light of that, whether he suspected that the end of the Beatles' empire was coming into sight. Or maybe not the empire, but the Beatles as a group. The song's appropriation by Charles Manson and his followers meant that it became associated with their crimes, one of the events of the late 60s that were taken to symbolise the end of the hippie era and the beginning of a more pessimistic, cynical, dark and morbid time. Gerald Carlin and Mark Jones have written that even before its Manson ties, which became much more pronounced after the 1974 publication of Vincent Bugliosi and Kurt Gentry's Helter Skelter, The True Story of the Manson Murders. Even before that, the song still seemed more synoptic of the slide from revolutionary optimism to disillusionment and crisis than any other more overtly political tracks of the period. This was the cultural mood that loyal Beatles devotees Black Sabbath were able to tap into and capitalise on in a more potent and seismic way than any of their contemporaries. In this respect, the downer rock descriptor that was applied to Black Sabbath by American journalists in the 1970s before heavy metal became a more commonly used term still seems rather fitting. Downer rock denoted an outlook at odds with the previous decade's hippie hopefulness, and with and also a kind of focus on bleaker subject matter, both in spiritual and material senses. It implied the tranquilizing effects of depressant drugs, downers rather than uppers, which matches Sabbath's music, thematically speaking, even if those individuals who were making it, not to mention many of its listeners, may have been experimenting with intoxicating substances at every end of the spectrum, including uppers. Downer rock implied a come down from drugs or sex or political romanticism, or simply sliding down from the top of a fairground ride. Helter Skelter had already hinted that the age of flower power positivity was over. Originally, Flair wearing long hairs themselves, Black Sabbath took this idea further than it could ever have been taken by Paul McCartney, who, however much he tries, no matter how hard he rocks out, can never fully suppress his innately upbeat, thumbs-up joie de vivre. Most people are on a permanent down, but just aren't aware of it, noted Black Sabbath's drummer Bill Ward. We are trying to express it for the people. As I said before, I don't take punk rock to be a particularly heavy style of music, although it did massively inspire countless heavy music makers. And I think that's partly because it tends to be fast and trebly, whereas various post-punk bands placed more emphasis on the bass and thus injected heaviness back into that scene. How do I explain this? At a punk concert, you're pogoing, right? You're jumping in the air. It's an upward motion. You might spit at the lead singer. Again, that's kind of an upward motion as well. In contrast, heavy music tends to be far more gravitational, headbanging. That's the opposite direction. That's going downwards. Heavy bass pulls you down towards the earth. So I was... does anyone remember floor punching as well? Is that still in the metal scene? There used to be a sort of dance where metal concerts people would go like that in the middle of the mosh pit. Again, downwards. It's like head banging taken another step further. So anyway, yeah, I was going to say something at the end about how an alternative title for the book, albeit one that even fewer people would understand, could be Electric Wizard's A Tapestry of Downer Rock, 1968 to the present. I was going to say that, but I was advised not to end on a downer. Those are my reflections. Thank you very much for listening. That's it.
Any questions?
Yeah, actually, have you ever heard or anyone like the 30-minute long version of Discourses?
No, I don't think anyone besides the people who made it and recorded it and have access to Abbey Road have heard it. Yeah, so it's there in Abbey Road in the archive, but it's not yet been released to the public. So that's why I'm saying we have to kind of speculate on what it would be like and whether it's a sort of doom metal classic from 1968. You know, maybe it's not. Maybe it's just like the normal version of Helter Skelter on repeat, which even so, that'd be good, wouldn't it?
So speaking of heaviness, in like the term of heaviness, what are your thoughts on the modern scene in the UK today. For example, there are like bands that are getting more and more popular, like Bring Me the Horizon, for example, or Architects, or even in more like underground scene, like Svalbard. What are your thoughts on that?
There's a really, really vibrant scene at the moment.
Is it heavy? Like, speaking of like Bring Me the Horizon per se, does it count as heavy music or not? Or is it just pop punk?
Is that a loaded question? What do you think? Are you saying it's just pop punk?
I'm not saying anything. It's just a question.
I end by
Somebody's going to kill me because I mentioned Bring Me the Horizon. Please don't punish me.
I'll go on record and say that I'm not a fan of Bring Me the Horizon. I wouldn't suggest they weren't heavy, but it's not the kind of heaviness that I'm into. I end by talking. Sorry.
What is the direction that the music is going at?
Well, I end by talking about pigs. Have you heard of them?
I did.
Who are kind of like that, and that kind of loops back to Black Sabbath, in that they are essentially a doom band, but they kind of doing slightly different things with doom. They're a bit more psychedelic perhaps than a lot of doom bands. There's a sort of Hawkwind space rock, acid rock influence to them, but they are very riff based. And there's a kind of interesting atmosphere at their concerts because they seem to have attracted a lot of metal fans, but also a lot of non-metal fans, which is interesting. And I think that's partly because they have a kind of celebratory, joyous nature to not necessarily their records, but their live gigs. So I end up talking about them, and also their kind of. They're bigger now than when the book came out, which is nice. You know, they're playing bigger venues. They've toured America now, which is great. At the time, they were operating kind of under the radar, like a lot of the bands in this book did originally. Just in Newcastle, in the north of England, which is a really interesting place because it's got this very eclectic underground scene that's always been there and still is there, and it's kind of the musicians there and not really bothered, it doesn't seem to me, about breaking out of that local scene. Pigs have done it almost by accident or, on their merits, but, they're not interested in what's going on in Manchester or Liverpool, certainly not in London. They're just kind of there enjoying themselves, making music, playing in each other's bands that don't sound anything like each other. And I could also tie that back to Black Sabbath in the way that kind of also that area of the northeast has been hit really hard by austerity measures from our Conservative government that we had for the last 12 years, whatever it was, and that could kind of loop back to Black Sabbath and them operating in the post-war period with all the rationing and difficulties that was around there that influenced their downer rock. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah.
Hi. Okay. We wondered, could you please name one band, which is maybe, I don't know, I always have to think of Girls' School, and they're one fucking great heavy metal band. I don't know. There are many... Oh, hi. Yeah, please could you name one heavy band which are women?
Yes. Well, as I say, I didn't want it to just be a load of white men playing rock music. I talk a little bit about Riot Girl in the book, which again is kind of punky, but I think there's a lot of Riot Girl that fits my heavy agenda in that it's quite loose and raucous and helter-skelter-like. Babes in Toyland, I would say, are fiercer than a lot of the metal bands that were around at the same time as Babes in Toyland. Even the early Hole records are pretty heavy. Also, to annoy the people reading that chapter, I also included a bit on. Oh, it's not on the big screen anymore. The new metal bit. I include a bit on the Canadian all-female new metal band Kitty, and defend them and say they're among the heaviest of the new metal lot, and how unfair it was that they were kind of ostracised just for being women, basically. You know, I think they're better than a lot, you know, Cold Chamber or whoever. Cold Chamber do have female bassists, don't they? So but they're not all women.
So yeah, I have a question. Have you ever slagged off a popular musician and he actually responded in a type of like a Morrissey or a Liam Gallagher, going like "fuck you, wanker," you know, stuff like that?
I've reviewed Morrissey negatively, but he didn't respond. Still waiting for the call. The best one was probably Idols, as I referred to in the in the lecture, and I don't want to go on about it all the time, but beloved English band Idols, who I don't particularly get on with. I wrote so as I say, I wrote a negative review about them, and that kind of spiraled out of control because the Sleaford Mods started tweeting about it because they thought it was really funny, because Sleaford Mods have a beef with Idols because Jason from Sleaford Mods thinks that Joe from Idols has kind of stolen his shtick to a certain extent. So Sleaford Mods found it funny. They started tweeting about it. Then Kenny Beats, who produced some of that album, started beefing with Sleaford Mods on Twitter, and they were having this huge argument, which was quite funny. And I don't know how many followers Kenny Beats has got. But Idol's response was that they produced a T-shirt with a line from the review and this kind of meme image that they then started selling on their online store. So, you know, hats off to them. They managed to even monetize the negative reviews in a cynical manner. So, yeah, that's probably the funniest one. I didn't buy the T-shirt. I was tempted to buy the T-shirt that I had inspired, but I thought, no, they should send me one for free. I'm not going to give them 25 quid plus postage.
Which songs from the White Album would you leave out?
Oh God. I'm not a big fan of Long, Long, Long. I'm not a huge fan of Revolution Number 9, although I see why people like it. What else is on there?
You have half an hour, so.
Yeah. I have the funny relationship with the White Album actually, because growing up, my dad had a cassette where he had recorded the White Album, but only the bits of the White Album that he enjoyed. Right, so it was like one side of a cassette, and growing up, that was what the White Album was like to me. And then when I was like a student or something, I bought like the proper White Album on CD, and it was like getting the deluxe version of the album with all the outtakes on it. So that was a weird experience. I'll have to look at the track listing again and go through and take them out. I can't recall I'll come back to you on it. I'll have to look at look at all the songs. I like the first disc better than the second disc, or the first two discs if it's LP. Okay. That's it. Thank you.